Chris leaned against the kitchen counter, his hands gripping his coffee mug tighter than usual. The faint aroma of Lauren's perfume still lingered in the air. She had left that morning, dressed impeccably, claiming she had back-to-back client meetings. Her excuse sounded plausible, even professional, but Chris couldn't shake the unease growing in his chest. It had started weeks ago. The subtle shifts in her behavior, the vague excuses, and the nights she returned home later than expected. At first, Chris chalked it up to the pressures of her job. Lauren was a go-getter, someone who thrived on networking and winning over clients. But the canceled plans had become a pattern. Dinner dates were brushed aside with a quick, "Sorry, work's hectic," and weekends became her personal me time, spent away from home. Chris didn't want to be paranoid. They'd been married for 12 years, and in all that time, he'd trusted Lauren implicitly. She was charismatic, driven, and effortlessly charming, qualities that had drawn him to her. But now, those same traits gnawed at him. Was he overthinking? Or was there something she wasn't telling him? The breaking point came 2 nights ago. Lauren had promised to attend a dinner with his colleagues, only to cancel at the last minute. Her text had been curt: "Sorry, can't make it, exhausted from work, rain check." Chris had smiled at his coworkers and waved off their questions about her absence, but his mind was elsewhere. That night, while lying in bed beside her, he'd noticed her phone buzzing. Lauren, who normally left her phone face up on the nightstand, had flipped it over and mumbled, "It's just work emails," before turning away. Now, standing alone in their kitchen, Chris couldn't ignore the nagging feeling any longer. He set the mug down and walked into the living room. On the coffee table lay his laptop. Hesitating for only a moment, he opened it and pulled up their shared phone account. It wasn't something he'd ever done before, but desperate times called for desperate measures. The call logs confirmed his suspicions. A number he didn't recognize appeared repeatedly over the past few weeks, especially during the hours Lauren had claimed to be working late. Chris clicked on the number and searched it online. His stomach dropped when he saw the result. A listing for a Michael Hayes, a high-profile consultant in the city known for his extravagant lifestyle. Michael Hayes wasn't just anyone. He was the kind of man who could easily charm anyone into his orbit. Chris's chest tightened, anger rising alongside disbelief. He couldn't confront Lauren outright, not without proof. If he was wrong, the accusation could shatter their trust forever. But if he was right, she wouldn't be able to talk her way out of it. He decided to follow her. It wasn't a decision he made lightly, but the alternative, doing nothing, was worse. That evening, as Lauren prepared to leave for another work meeting, Chris kissed her cheek and casually asked, "When do you think you'll be back?" Lauren smiled, her lipstick flawless. "Not too late, don't wait up." She grabbed her purse and slipped out the door. Chris waited for 5 minutes before grabbing his jacket and keys. His heart pounded as he started the car, adrenaline coursing through him. He tailed her from a safe distance, careful not to get too close. His suspicion turned to certainty when her car pulled into the parking lot of an upscale restaurant on the other side of town. Lauren stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement, and walked inside. Chris parked nearby and waited. Minutes later, he saw him. A man who could only be Michael. Tall, confident, and immaculately dressed, Michael strode into the restaurant and greeted Lauren with a familiarity that made Chris's blood boil. The two were seated at a table near the window, their body language unmistakably intimate. Chris stayed in the car, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. The betrayal he'd feared was real, and now he had to decide what to do next. Chris sat in his car across the street from the restaurant, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows over his dashboard. His pulse hammered in his ears as he watched Lauren and Michael through the restaurant window. From where he sat, they seemed worlds away, sharing an expensive bottle of wine and leaning in close. Every laugh, every shared glance was like a dagger to Chris's chest. This wasn't just dinner between colleagues. It was too intimate, too familiar. Lauren twirled a strand of her blonde hair absent-mindedly as she laughed at something Michael said. He reached across the table, resting his hand briefly on hers, and Chris felt his stomach twist. For years, those gestures had been his. Her light laugh, her subtle touches, her sparkling eyes. Now, they were stolen, given to someone else. Chris's phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him out of his thoughts. It was a text from his best friend, David. He had confided in David earlier about his suspicions, and the text was simple but firm. Whatever you do, keep your cool. You need undeniable proof. Chris exhaled slowly and nodded to himself. Proof. That was the only way to ensure Lauren and Michael wouldn't wriggle out of this confrontation. He had to be smart, methodical. Acting on emotion would only let them spin a narrative where he was the villain. Reaching into his glove compartment, Chris pulled out a small camera he'd bought earlier that day. On an impulse he now realized was foresight. It was discreet and easy to use, perfect for documenting the truth. He stepped out of his car, careful to stay hidden in the shadows, and walked toward the restaurant's large windows. The warmth of the interior clashed with the cold January air, but Chris's focus was unshakable. He positioned himself just far enough to avoid suspicion, then zoomed in on the table where Lauren and Michael sat. Click. The camera captured Michael's hand brushing against Lauren's as they shared a toast. Click. Another shot showed her laughing, leaning in as if the world outside their bubble didn't exist. Click. A third photo showed Michael placing a hand on her knee beneath the table. Chris gritted his teeth, each shutter sound cementing his growing fury. After gathering enough photos to make his case airtight, Chris slipped back to his car. His heart raced, but his mind was sharp now, calculating his next steps. Watching them from a distance wasn't enough. He needed to confront them, to rip the facade off their betrayal and expose it in the most public way possible. They deserved to feel the humiliation they had inflicted on him. Before leaving, Chris checked his phone again. He scrolled through Lauren's recent text messages, something he'd felt ashamed of doing earlier but now viewed as necessary. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. A string of messages between Lauren and Michael confirmed their affair in no uncertain terms. The texts ranged from flirtatious to outright explicit, and as Chris read through them, a mix of anger and clarity washed over him. One particular message stood out. Can't wait to see you tonight. Same table as last time. It was all the confirmation Chris needed. His grip on the phone tightened, but instead of letting rage consume him, he took a deep breath and reminded himself of his plan. As he drove home that night, Chris's mind churned with possibilities. He envisioned himself barging into the restaurant, making a scene in front of everyone. He pictured Lauren and Michael squirming under the weight of his accusations, the other diners whispering, shaking their heads in judgment. But no, he needed something more strategic, more impactful. Chris spent the next few hours preparing meticulously. He compiled the photos he'd taken, screenshots of the text messages, and even printed out a few incriminating details from their shared phone account. He wanted to ensure there was no room for doubt. By the time he was finished, the clock read 2 a.m., but sleep was the last thing on his mind. The next morning, Chris sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and staring at Lauren's side of the bed, now empty. She had left early again, claiming she had another busy day ahead, more work, she'd said with a peck on his cheek that felt hollow now. Chris watched the seconds tick by on the kitchen clock, counting down to his moment of reckoning. That evening, when Lauren stepped out, dressed in her usual elegant style, Chris kept his expression neutral. Another work thing, he asked casually, masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. She nodded, her eyes darting away as she adjusted her earrings. Yes, don't wait up. Chris smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sure, have fun. The moment the door clicked shut, Chris grabbed his coat and the envelope containing the evidence. Tonight would be the night. He wasn't going to sit quietly in the shadows any longer. The cozy ambiance of the restaurant was a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside Chris as he pushed through the front doors. Warm, dim lighting bathed the room in a golden hue, and the quiet murmur of diners created an air of calm that felt almost surreal to him. For a moment, he paused just inside, scanning the room. His heart pounded in his chest, not with hesitation, but with the determination of a man who knew what he had to do. Across the room, at a corner table near a large window, he spotted them. Lauren's blonde hair caught the light as she tilted her head back to laugh at something Michael said. Michael sat across from her, his hand resting casually on the stem of his wine glass, his body angled toward her in an unmistakably intimate posture. Chris took a deep breath and stepped forward, weaving through the maze of tables with a quiet, deliberate stride. He wasn't here to scream or cause a chaotic scene. He wanted this moment to be calculated, precise, and unforgettable. The sound of his shoes tapping against the hardwood floor seemed to echo louder with every step. As he approached their table, Lauren's laughter faltered. She looked up and her eyes widened in shock. Chris? She stammered, her voice rising slightly in pitch. Michael turned to glance at Chris, his confident smirk fading as he noticed the steely determination in the man's eyes. "Who's this?" Michael asked, leaning back in his chair, as though bracing himself. Chris didn't respond right away. He pulled out the third chair at their table and sat down, his calm demeanor unnerving Lauren more than any outburst could have. He placed an envelope on the table, tapping it lightly with his fingers before folding his hands in front of him. "Don't mind me," Chris said, his tone icy but controlled. "I thought I'd join you two for dinner. After all, it seems we've been sharing a lot lately." Lauren's face turned pale, her polished facade slipping as she searched for something, anything, to say. "Chris, this isn't what it looks like," she began, but her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. Chris arched an eyebrow, letting her squirm under his gaze. "It isn't? Well, that's a relief, because it looks like my wife has been sneaking around behind my back, canceling plans with me to have romantic dinners with another man. But since you say it's not what it looks like, Lauren, why don't you explain it to me?" Michael cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Listen, man, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Chris turned to him sharply, cutting him off mid-sentence. "And you must be Michael Hayes," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "The man who thinks it's perfectly fine to sleep with another man's wife and then sit here sipping wine like you have no shame." Michael bristled but didn't respond. The attention of nearby diners began to shift toward their table, curious whispers and subtle glances adding to the tension in the air. Lauren reached out, placing her hand on Chris's arm in an attempt to calm him. "Chris, please, let's talk about this in private." He pulled his arm away, his expression hardening. "Private? Oh no, Lauren. You didn't give me the courtesy of privacy when you decided to humiliate me like this. So why should I give you that luxury now?" He opened the envelope and began laying out the evidence on the table. First, the photos he'd taken through the restaurant window during their previous meetings. Then the printed text messages between Lauren and Michael, each one more damning than the last. Finally, a copy of the call log showing the frequency of their late-night conversations. Lauren's hands trembled as she looked at the evidence, her composure crumbling with every passing second. "Chris, Don't," Chris interrupted, his voice sharp. "Don't you dare try to justify this. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this is anything other than what it is. You lied to me, Lauren. Repeatedly. You betrayed me." Michael shifted uncomfortably, looking around as the other diners began to whisper more audibly. "All right, this is getting ridiculous," he said, attempting to stand. Chris stood too, his movements slow but deliberate. He leaned in close to Michael, his voice low but forceful. "Sit down." There was no mistaking the threat in Chris's tone, and Michael reluctantly obeyed, sinking back into his chair. "You think this ends here?" Chris continued, his gaze boring into Michael's. "Do you think you can walk into my life, destroy my marriage, and walk away without consequences? I've already spoken to my lawyer. Lauren has no claim to my assets. And you, Michael? Well, let's just say you might want to think twice before showing your face around town again." Lauren buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. "Chris, I never meant for it to get this far," she sobbed. "Not meant to get this far?" Chris scoffed. "Lauren, it didn't just get this far. You chose this. Every text, every lie, every touch. Those were choices you made. Don't act like this was some accident." The manager approached cautiously, offering to defuse the situation, but Chris waved him off. He wasn't finished yet. Looking back at Lauren and Michael, he straightened his posture, his voice steady and final. "You'll get your wish, Lauren. You're free. But don't think for a second that you're walking away unscathed. Enjoy your dinner. It's your last one on my dime." With that, Chris turned and walked out, the murmurs of the stunned diners trailing behind him. He felt lighter somehow, the weight of betrayal lifting as he left Lauren and Michael to sit in the wreckage of their choices. The chill of the night air hit Chris as he stepped out of the restaurant, but he barely noticed. His mind raced with fragments of the confrontation, Lauren's trembling hands, Michael's nervous shifting, the collective whispers of the other diners. Yet, as the door closed behind him, silencing the noise, Chris felt an unexpected calm wash over him. It was done. He stood by his car for a moment, staring at the stillness of the street. The weight he had carried for weeks, suspicions, doubts, and the gnawing sense of betrayal seemed to dissipate into the night. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For the first time in months, he felt like he could truly breathe. As he drove home, Chris's thoughts turned inward. The confrontation had gone exactly as he'd planned, but the victory felt hollow. Sure, he had exposed Lauren and Michael for what they were, humiliated them in the process, and reclaimed a sense of dignity. But beneath the triumph, there was still pain. A deep, aching wound left by the woman he had once trusted with his heart. The house was quiet when he entered. Lauren wasn't home, and he doubted she would return that night. The emptiness was almost eerie, the silence amplifying the reality of what had happened. Chris walked into the living room, sat on the couch, and stared at the photos he had spread across the coffee table earlier. They were evidence of her deceit, but now they felt like artifacts of a life he no longer recognized. He picked up one of the photos, Lauren and Michael smiling at each other over wine, and studied it. For a fleeting moment, he wondered how things had come to this. Was it something he had done? Was there a moment, a choice, that had set them on this path? He quickly dismissed the thought. No, this wasn't his failure. It was hers. Lauren had made her choices, and now she would have to live with them. The next morning, Chris woke to the sound of his phone buzzing. It was a text from his lawyer confirming that the papers he had prepared to protect his assets were ready for filing. Chris had anticipated Lauren might try to manipulate the situation, perhaps play the victim to gain some advantage, but he was prepared. She would get nothing more from him. Not his money. Later that day, Chris took a box from the bedroom and began packing Lauren's things. He moved methodically, folding her clothes and placing her belongings neatly inside. There was no malice in his actions, just closure. With every item he placed in the box, he felt himself letting go of the life they had built together. By the time he finished, the room felt lighter, as though the act of removing her presence had exorcised the last remnants of her betrayal. The days that followed were a blur of small but significant changes. Chris contacted a locksmith to replace the house's locks. He updated his phone plan to remove her number from the account. He even rearranged the furniture in the living room, creating a space that felt entirely his own. These actions, though mundane, symbolized a fresh start, a life untainted by lies. Word of the confrontation at the restaurant spread quickly, thanks to a few witnesses who couldn't resist sharing the drama on social media. Chris received texts and calls from friends, some offering support, others expressing shock at Lauren's betrayal. He appreciated their concern but found himself reluctant to talk about it. The confrontation was behind him now, and rehashing it would only keep him tethered to a chapter he was ready to close. One evening, as Chris sat on the back porch with a glass of bourbon, he reflected on what lay ahead. The betrayal had broken something in him, yes, but it had also revealed a resilience he hadn't known he possessed. He had confronted the truth, taken control of the situation, and emerged stronger. Now, he had the opportunity to rebuild not just his life but himself. A knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, he found his neighbor Rachel standing there with a casserole dish in hand. "I heard about everything," she said gently. "Thought you might need some comfort food." Chris chuckled, the first real laugh he'd had in weeks. "Thanks, Rachel, I appreciate it." As they stood there talking, Chris felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected. Hope. It wasn't romantic or profound, just the simple realization that life went on, that connections could still be formed, and that the future was still his to shape. That night, Chris placed the casserole in the fridge, grabbed a notepad, and began jotting down plans for the next chapter of his life. Travel, hobbies he'd neglected, friendships he wanted to nurture. It all flowed onto the page. For the first time in a long time, the possibilities felt endless. The betrayal had marked him, yes, but it hadn't defined him. Chris was still standing, and as he looked out at the night sky, he promised himself one thing. He would never let anyone dim his light again.